Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our seminar. Welcome to our speaker. It's very good of you to be with us. My remarks need be only very, very brief. Just to say, though, that you are right to mention Aubrey Herbert. Aubrey, for all of us, has a kind of a romantic, soft appeal, and a sense, of course, of tragic loss of what only could have emerged from such a brilliant intellect. In some ways, typical of this generation, the free roaming, adventurous spirit, which was so common in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. But of course, he was an exceptionally distinguished representative of that breed. And so it's always both sad and interesting to hear a talk about him. And we'd like to welcome you to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in tonight about a historical character that captured my attention as well as yours while reading about World War I and researching in British archives. Far from being an exhaustive account of Aubrey Herbert's short but fascinating existence, my lecture tonight is an attempt to look at his writings and actions from what I call a Turkish perspective. So what do I mean by Turkish perspective or Turkological perspective? I mean a historical and cultural approach that does not consider the Ottoman Empire and with it the whole Near East as a single entity where elsewhere accepted values, principles, and evaluation criteria cease to exist. In other words, the Turkish perspective is the only antidote to the Orientalist approach. So with this premise in mind, I will begin my talk, hoping that it will act as a stimulus to reconsider some outstanding historical characters, such as Aubrey Herbert, that mainstream historiography has, so to say, a little bit dismissed as being merely unconventional. So although expressed in singular, otherness is a plural concept. Indeed, figures such as Gertrude Bell, Edwin Montagu, Aubrey Herbert, and Sigrid Sassoon lived exemplary lives that cannot be considered under a single label. Their common trait was perhaps that they did not fit into the categories to which they were expected to belong. Gertrude Bell, yes?
It's on your computer. If you want to do it for a single, if you want to do just a single,
If you just
yeah,
click
right
next to it on the left.
yeah, there we go. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, and
Perfect.
maybe I can push it a little bit further.
Okay,
like
there we go.
this.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So Gertrude Bell was an unmarried polyglot lady. Edwin Montagu, an anti-Zionist Jewish politician. Aubrey Herbert, a pro-Turkish aristocrat. And Sigrid Sassoon, a pacifist and decorated World War I veteran whose mother was a Wagner fan Anglo-Catholic and whose father was a Baghdadi Jewish. Their disagreement with British government policy before, during, and after World War I was expressed in diversified and mostly individual ways, not aligned with any party or political movement of the time. Unorthodox individualists, their dissent was rather the effect of the unique combination of their exceptional personalities, peculiar family backgrounds, and the extraordinary historical times in which they lived. While Sigrid Sassoon's dissent, encouraged by Bertrand Russell and immortalized in Pat Barker's novel, Regeneration, emerged from the battlefield as a humanistic philosophical standpoint, Bell, Montagu, and Herbert structured their aversion to British Eastern policy out of their former deep and passionate acquaintance with different areas of the Eastern world. Gertrude Bell who had lived and traveled extensively in Persia and in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire since the last decades of the 1800s, vented her bitterness in a letter to Aubrey Herbert, written in April 1919, as follows. Oh, my dear, they are making such a horrible muddle of the Near East. I confidently anticipate that it will be much worse than it was before the war. It's like a nightmare in which you foresee all the horrible things which are going to happen and can't stretch out your hand to prevent them, end quote. Her friend, Edwin Montague, for his part, wrote to George Curzon in August 1919 that, and I quote, the suggestions made from time to time for the fate of Turkey have always shocked me as being animated by a vindictiveness which we have shown to no other of our enemies, end quote. More inherently to his institutional function as Secretary of State for India, he stated in April 1919 to Lloyd George that, and I quote again, if you turn the Turk out of Constantinople and also cut him off from the Sea of Marmara, deprive him of Smyrna, leave him no strip of territory in which he is free, this is a policy which, so far as I can discover, no expert, either in the Foreign Office or in the India Office, views without grave political alarm from the point of view of the whole Mohammedan world, end quote. Firmly opposed to Zionism, he criticized the Balfour Declaration for laying the foundations of what he felt would turn the Ottoman Palestine into the world's ghetto, with, I quote, Turks and other Mohammedans regarded as foreigners, just in the same way as Jews will hereafter be treated as foreigners in every country but Palestine, end quote. Due to an understandably irreconcilable disagreement with the politics of Lloyd George, he ended up resigning his post in 1922. So from the mud of the trenches in Verdun and in the midst of rotting human flesh, Siegfried Sassoon had managed to imagine a theoretical standing and make a formal protest. This led to him being committed to a lunatic asylum due to the British government considering his stance unacceptable on a political level. Edwin Montague's pro-Ottoman endorsement was a consequence of his vision of the British Empire, which had to be a home to all, Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. Gertrude Bell's Eastern education had started in Persia and continued in Arab countries, influenced as they were by Abdulhamid II's pan-Islamist ideology. So in this diversified and decidedly plural spectrum of otherness vis-à-vis British mainstream policy, Aubrey Herbert and Edith Durham were the only ones who approached the Eastern question through the Balkans. In 1904, unimpressed by Athens, sorry, because I can't see from here the list of the slides, so sometimes I will try to go further. Okay. So in 1904, as I was saying, unimpressed by Athens, Herbert made his way to Salonika, explored Macedonia on horseback, met his Albanian soulmate Kazim, and wrote to his mother that, I quote, no country that I have been has interested me so much, end quote. Appointed honorary attaché at the British Embassy in Constantinople, he contacted members of the Committee of Unity and Progress, whom Italian High Commissioner Carlo Sforza called the living forces of the nation. The Young Turks were the last shining example of the centuries-long Ottoman tradition of Balkan-based leading class recruitment. Herbert had a direct approach to people. In the second volume of his trilogy of memoirs, the English writer Lawrence Evelyn Jones described him as living, I quote, in high romance. All his thoughts were open and at our service. he had no reserves with those he liked. His activities were abreast of his nightly imagination, end quote. While such an open-minded and generous attitude might not always turn out to be an advantage in politics, it certainly contributed to Aubrey Herbert's passionate adhesion to the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. After the 1908 coup, he wrote a long and eloquent account for The Spectator, through which his own attachment to the new constitution emerged with clarity. Will these men from the country who have done so much be able to hold their own against European intrigue and the rapacity of the West? Inshallah, God builds the nest of the blind bird, says the Turkish proverb. Aubrey Herbert's exceptionality was fully recognized by his peers and contemporaries. Edward Cadogan, conservative politician, World War I veteran, and Herbert's college mate, wrote that Aubrey was cast in a mold different from the normal individual. He was born out of due time and space. Interesting definition, although it is difficult to determine to what age in history in all the world his soul belonged, end quote. From both sides, his family descended from the Howards. His grandfather, the third Earl of Carnarvon, is described by Margaret Fitzherbert, Aubrey Herbert's granddaughter and biographer, as an eccentric and a romantic, a traveler and keen observer of revolutions, who harangued a revolutionary mob in France in Nice and almost got killed in a political brawl in Genoa. Although Aubrey was the first of the Howards to embrace the Eastern question body and soul, his family did not lack early connections with Istanbul, where his father was taken on a family trip when he was a 7-year-old in 1838 and even caught the plague. He survived, studied at Eton, then at Oxford, and ultimately settled down to marriage and politics. Margaret Fitzherbert writes that, and I quote, "In politics his sensitive conscience proved a barrier to advancement. Twice a cabinet minister, on both occasions he had felt impelled to resign office on matters of principle," end quote. 3 years after his first wife died giving birth to their fourth child, he married his first cousin, Elsie Howard, who gave birth to Aubrey on April the 3rd, 1880. His parents seemed to enjoy being the offspring of the same family and celebrated their common ancestry by nicknaming their son Hereward, after the Anglo-Saxon nobleman and leader of local resistance to the Norman conquest, who was believed to be the Howard's progenitor. In fact, recent research proves that he wasn't, but it is relevant to note that Aubrey Herbert's early relational and educational context was proudly distant from a quiescent indulgence in what was perceived as normal, even from an aristocratic point of view. From this aspect, relevant similarities are found by the biographer between Aubrey and his more radically unconventional paternal uncle Oberon, an ardent follower of Herbert Spencer and himself a vegetarian, agnostic, and pacifist. Probably due to his parents' consanguinity, Aubrey was born with a congenital malformation of the eyes, which considerably weakened his sight to the extent that he was partially blind. Homeschooled till the age of 13, he was educated almost exclusively by ear. After so many years and without any witnesses left, it is difficult to draw conclusions, but the educational strategies implemented to deal with his handicap might have accentuated Herbert's capacity to listen, memorize, and refine the perception of the space around him through what he heard in a subtler way than sighted people. Scientists claim that auditory functions can expand into regions of the brain, which typically would have visual functions, therefore compensating the loss of vision. The Turkish proverb, "Kör kuşun yuvasını Allah yapar," God builds the nest of the blind bird, had probably not been quoted by chance. His ability to learn foreign languages, for instance, encouraged since the earliest years of his life, was further exercised with success when he became honorary attaché in Istanbul. In fact, the British ambassador, Nicholas O'Connor, had high standards and encouraged his staff to learn Eastern languages. Herbert, who already knew French, Italian, and a little German, took lessons in Turkish, Arabic, and Greek. Later in life, he also learned a smattering of Albanian. I couldn't find information his level of Arabic and Greek, but clues from his letters suggest that his level of Turkish was more than satisfactory and sufficient to understand rather complex discussions. More specifically, there is evidence that he had reached the level that allows us non-native speakers to enjoy the pleasure of conversation with mother tongue natives and to understand what they say among themselves. His wife, Mary, whom he occasionally called my Karakash, wrote to her mother-in-law that Aubrey insists that Turkish is the only true language for endearment. But I don't think somehow that either you or I would feel much reality about Turkish. During their last encounter in Germany, which we shall have occasion to return to, he spoke to Talat Pasha in French because, by his own admission, his Turkish was rusty. They were traveling from Hamm to Düsseldorf in an empty second-class compartment when a German engineer entered their carriage. Talat said in Turkish to me, "We cannot speak in French in Germany. It is too unpopular, and I do not know English. We had therefore better talk Turkish." Then the German engineer interrupted them, asking what language they were speaking. "Turkish," said Talat, and for some time we talked bad German, which he occasionally translated for my benefit into Turkish. Then Talat said to me, speaking in Turkish, "A curious thing has happened. This German believes that you also are a Turk. As he hears you talk Turkish to me, now for the first time, you are going to hear the whole truth about the Allies and your own country." Aubrey Herbert mastered the Turkish language well enough to be able to discern different language registers. In 1908, when he described the grey eminence of the British Embassy, Irish senior dragoman Gerald Fitzmaurice, he wrote, I quote, "He could often talk the Turk's language as well as the Turk. He used the same silences and gutturals as deep as the Pashas, some of whom he had grown to respect. Now, in the place of the old Pashas, with their stately presence, high honorifics, their venerable beards, he was called upon to meet a miscellany of Jews from Salonika, Turkish boulevardiers, and mustachioed Syrians from Lausanne, who spoke to him not in Turkish, but in the French of Vera. Nevertheless, learning Turkish as any other foreign language does not necessarily make you sympathetic to any development of Turkish politics. Some Orientalists may very well embody the concept of the intellectual in uniform deplored by Edward Said. Aubrey Herbert knew that Fitzmaurice despised the policy of the Committee of Unity and Progress, which had ousted the British puppet Ottoman liberals. In 1913, on the eve of World War I, after a dinner at the embassy in Istanbul, an angry Aubrey Herbert wrote to his brother Mervyn that Fitzmaurice, and I quote, "loathes Turkey and after that England," end quote. Maybe Fitzmaurice did not hate England as a whole, but certainly disliked the Britain that Aubrey Herbert proudly represented by hanging out with the young Turks, his peers in age, with whom he habitually dined and lunched. And I quote, "Why shouldn't I? The ambassador didn't mind. Fitz will catch a cold whispering behind doors," end quote. Unsurprisingly, in the same period, Carlos Sforza frequented the Cercle de l'Orient to meet Mustafa Kemal's friends. "It caused a scandal," he wrote, "yet those I saw were the future leaders of the Turkish Republic, and I felt that they were not boasting when they told me without emphasis that they could maintain their independence in Anatolia, where most of them were already inclined to retreat," end quote. Another Britain and another Italy were observing the birth of a new Turkey, different from the Ottoman Empire. Would that be enough to imagine another Europe? Would that be enough to imagine another Near East? Aubrey Herbert's granddaughter and biographer shared the same conservative prejudice vis-à-vis the Turkish world as his wife and his mother, describing with amused yet distant indulgence her grandfather's passionate enthusiasm for the East. Her attitude sometimes resembles the pitiful benevolence that skeptics reserve for those who believe in astrology. He left Istanbul with heavy heart in 1905, and she wrote, "But he could no more stay away from the decaying capital and its wild empire than a moth can stay away from the light." A little bit slightly Orientalist. After experiencing firsthand the effects of British policy on the Ottoman Empire and more generally the Middle Eastern scenario, the political skirmishes at home must have seemed irrelevant to Herbert, who by family tradition was a member of the Conservative Party. According to current democratic standards, we might argue that he wasn't really interested in politics, since the issues of consent and representation did not seem to have a particular relevance to him. In May 1918, during a fiery debate in the House of Commons, asked why he voted with the opposition in favor of some allegations against Lloyd George, he answered that, and I quote, "On certain occasions, I choose to behave as a gentleman and not a politician," end quote. Grande. On another occasion, and you know, as long as I will go on, you will perceive greatly my enthusiasm for this character. Okay, I will try to keep myself a little bit, but I don't know if I'll be able to. On another occasion, he wrote to his wife a sentence that may very well be considered the quintessential resistance to the very idea of democracy. And I quote, "The people who trust me now are the best people. And I'm not going to lose or alter the quality of their trust to get thin applause from a majority," end quote. Nevertheless, the British political arena was changing quickly, and feudal-inspired niche viewpoints, such as the Herberts, were becoming less and less tolerated. After his death, his uncle Oberon was accused in a damning obituary in the Times to have, I quote, "followed his bent with an absolute disregard for convention and authority. If he had come of a less aristocratic stock, it is possible that the respect for the opinion of others, with checks eccentricity among the middle classes, might have induced a greater soundness of judgment," end quote. Raymond Asquith, son of Henry Asquith, who would be Liberal Prime Minister from 1908 to 1916, urged Aubrey Herbert to join the Liberal Party on the account of bleak prospects for a conservative future. Taking humorous inspiration in his letters, he even suggests that Herbert may go in as a Labour candidate. Don't you see the theatrical capabilities of that, writes Raymond Asquith, the young aristocrat with ideals and sympathies which carry him passionately out of his class. A tribune of the people, Gracchus, Rienzi, Tolstoy, anyone you like. It would explain your clothes too, end quote. Humor aside, when mentioning ideals and sympathies carrying Herbert out of his class, was Asquith also referring to Herbert's fellow feeling for Turks and Balkan Muslims? After all, Aubrey Herbert had never shown any particular interest in trade unionist ideals, nor for the social struggle at all. In 1912, he even voted against women's suffrage in the free vote in the House of Commons. And his biographer writes, Aubrey's attitude to the British elector was one of benevolent feudalism, and so it remained. Raymond Asquith was a highly cultivated young man who had a precise idea of the historical and almost literary tradition he was referring to when joking about the possibility that Herbert could become a tribune of the people and adhere to the Labour Party. Well, in that tradition, the Eastern question, as yet, had no citizenship. So, should we conclude that according to Asquith, what brought Herbert out of his class was precisely his heartfelt adhesion to the Turkish cause? As for Asquith and the other liberals, it was the adoption of a strong anti-Turkish policy that made the Liberal Party, from William Gladstone onwards, the most fruitful political instrument of the British new industrial class, against whose growing hegemony Benjamin Disraeli had even considered an alliance of the Conservative Party with Chartism. Before World War I and the progressive rise to power of Winston Churchill, this connection between foreign and internal politics had not been established in other parties as clearly as among the liberals. It is therefore significant that the young and promising Raymond Asquith suggested an indirect analogy between left-wing viewpoints and a pro-Turkish vision, almost insinuating that they were both expressions of the same unorthodox approach that would have alienated any gentleman from his own social context. Notwithstanding the liberals, we all know how distant the Young Turks were from movements of social upheaval. In 1908, for instance, the Committee of Unity and Progress supported the Ottoman government to enact a labor legislation that banned trade unions in the public sector, introduced compulsory arbitration, made strike action extremely difficult, if not impossible. These men of order, who were Freemasons and almost blindly devoted to positivism, would later despise Turkish communists, whom they considered, sometimes rightly, to be Russian agents. In 1921, Talat talked to Herbert about Bolshevism with much dislike. He had never met Lenin, but knew Lev Trotsky, whom he considered, I quote, a degenerate, end quote. And then he says, Enver is now in Moscow, but is not a Bolshevik, end quote, meaning that the former Minister of War was allied with the Russians out of pure political interest. In fact, Aubrey Herbert's admiration for the Young Turks and for the East in general was more connected to traditional than innovative values. After the 1908 coup, he wrote an eloquent letter to his brother, in which he drew a comparison between the British and the Ottoman Empire. I quote, "I wish them the good luck, the Young Turks. The trouble will begin after they have elected their parliament. Equality is charming as a sentiment, but Turkey will find it just as impracticable in their empire as we have in ours." That's the non-Orientalist approach. Civis Romanus sum is all right, where all are Romans. And though we are Romans in theory, when our Indians claim equality, they don't get it. You are bound to have trouble and exclusion or inequality where one class is ready to live for a quarter of what another will take. The Turk is the dominant race, and in the interest of peace, he should show that straight away, or blood will run in thick rivers in Constantinople, end quote. And somehow his words echo Ziagakalb's prose from the time of the Libyan War, when he said, "Why should we give up Trablusgarh when France would never give up its Algeria?" Enthusiasm for the 1908 coup did not last long. On one side, the Balkan countries were beginning to realize that a strong, reformed empire did not suit their nationalist aspirations. On the other, the Young Turks were becoming aware that the European powers, who had for so long preached reform, in fact preferred the old corrupt ways that gave them an excuse to meddle in the old Ottoman world. During his last talk with Herbert, Talat's memory returned to the disappointment caused by the lack of British support for the 1908 revolution. Never, I think, in history of the world did one power have such a commanding position and so obsess another as did Great Britain to Turkey when we made our revolution. You drove us into the arms of Germany. End quote. Aubrey Herbert agreed with Talat. He writes, "All he said was true and made Englishmen like myself very heartily ashamed. Our government was sent to us as an affliction from God." End quote. Letters to his mother, written as early as in 1909, argued exactly the same concepts expressed by Talat in 1921, almost as if they had been stated by the same person. Aubrey Herbert had complete respect for Talat and the other Young Turks. He loved Istanbul and the excitement provided by political intrigue and gossip, though it was the physical thrill of danger experienced in Albania that stimulated his mind and body incomparably. During the 3 years between his election to the House of Commons and the outbreak of World War I, he worked tirelessly for the cause of Albanian nationalism. One may wonder how he could pledge the cause of the Ottoman Empire and at the same time advocate Albania's independence. So Herbert was a man of principle, but also a man of action, who took steps according to circumstances. The political solution prospected by the Young Turks' revolution, which he had so strongly endorsed, was rejected by his country's mainstream policy. Therefore, the survival of the empire appeared to hang by a thread. The political battle was lost. The situation was changing quickly, and at the outbreak of the Balkan Wars, it appeared clear that the European Muslims, unlike the foreign-supported Orthodox Christians, would be the main victims of the conflict. Of course, Herbert was emotionally attached to Albania, but the principal reason he supported its independence was that it embodied the cause of European Islam in all its forms, including that of being the creed of the only local leading class that could allow, according to Herbert, a long-lasting coexistence among different religions. In 1912, he went to the Sanjak of Novi Bazar, which in those turbulent times was a no-man's land, and met Issa Boletin, a legendary outlaw who was said to have 20,000 men under his command. Issa Bey thought that Herbert was an Austrian spy, aiming to seize his land. But Herbert, who had admired the chieftain at first sight, told him that he was an English landowner. I quote, "I have too much land of my own and don't want yours. It is a bad business being a landlord today. Lands brings you in practically nothing, end quote. Their friendship was long and fruitful. When the first stage of the Balkan war was over, Albania was invaded on all sides and full of starving refugees. In the north, Montenegrins had committed atrocities. Scutari was under Serbian siege. And in the south, the Greeks perpetrated ethnic cleansing and forced Hellenization. Herbert couldn't wait to take initiative and founded the Albanian Committee in London with the aim of gathering donations and support for the Albanian delegation in its negotiation with the great powers, which he called animal in their lusts, Pharisees in their aspirations. A member of the numerous and all but homogeneous Albanian delegation was Isa Boletin, whom Herbert, as his biographer reports, took under his personal protection and even brought to the House of Commons, where his startling appearance caused a considerable stir. Reciprocity is a highly valued feeling among Albanians as well as among Turks, and gratitude rained down on Herbert, who was proposed as King of Albania during the peace conference in 1913. He took the proposal very seriously. His wife was ready to leave, but finally rejected it, knowing that on one side his revenue was not large enough to compensate Albania's scarce propensity and capacity to pay taxes, and on the other that the British government, at that time unwilling to meddle in the Adriatic question, would have not supported him against the interference of other countries such as Austria and Russia. Eager to look like a nation, Albania accepted William of Wied as king. Edith Durham, whom Herbert met in 1913 in Durazzo, wrote to him that the newly appointed king, completely unaware of the customs of his people, boasted that, invited for dinner at a chieftain's house, he had refused all the dishes. He was told that the king's party behaved badly, and even, I quote, gave great offense by openly laughing at the dishes and at the manner of serving, end quote. 6 months later, Austria declared war on Serbia, insurgents threatened Durazzo, and William of Wied, with his impolite court, fled the country and returned to Germany. He would still retain formally the title until 1925. Aubrey Herbert continued writing his diary even during the war. While fighting in France, he was wounded and imprisoned by the Germans until September 1914, when the hospital where he was lying was freed by the French troops. At the suggestion and then explicit will of Mark Sykes, his second destination was Cairo, where he had to report to the Arab Bureau. Nevertheless, he felt frustrated and obviously disagreed with his government's policy vis-à-vis the Arab world. In February 1915, he objected to Mark Sykes that the strategy used in Syria was wrong and begged for, I quote, a piece of imperial wit, end quote. Sykes' answer was eloquent. I perceive by your letter that you are a pro-Turk still. Your policy is wrong. Turkey must cease to be. This was the British politician, as we all know, who 1 year later would shape the future of the Middle East with François-Georges Picot in the famous secret agreement. Herbert's standing had been completely diminished, and even his immediate superior at the Arab Bureau, Colonel Newcomb, was anxious to be rid of him. On April the 12th, 1915, he left Cairo on a boat for Limnos, where the British Mediterranean Expeditionary Force was gathering for the Gallipoli invasion. Aubrey Herbert took part in the landing at Anzac and the bloody battle that followed. He writes to his wife, I am pretty hardened now. but they all go to my heart, our men and the Turks. You see very splendid things on both sides. End quote. Like most of the soldiers involved, he vehemently blamed Winston Churchill for the hastily taken decision to besiege the Dardanelles. Knowing him as a vibrant Turcophile and imagining what the battlefront must have looked like at the beginning of May 1915, his attempt to arrange a ceasefire for the burial of the dead acquires greater paradigmatic relevance. General Ian Hamilton, commander-in-chief of the Enterprise, disliked Herbert at first sight. Interestingly, in his diary, he judged him, I quote, excessively unorthodox, end quote. Initially, Hamilton refused the truce, but Herbert insisted, stressing matters of sanitation. So the general, though skeptical, finally had to accept. The truce was discussed by William Birdwood and Kemal Bey Aubrey, the two commanders on the battlefield. For the safety of Kemal Bey, Herbert was sent as a blindfolded hostage to the Ottoman camp. A happy hostage, writes his biographer. And I quote, at last he was taken to a tent in a grove where the blindfold was removed, and his host, Sahib Bey, said, this is the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Mm-hmm. They ate cheese and drank tea and coffee, end quote. Later, he was recognized by a company of Albanians who started clapping him on the back. In his diary, Herbert wrote that the situation on the battlefield was indescribable. I quote, one saw the result of machine gun fire very clearly, entire companies annihilated, not wounded, but killed, their heads doubled under them with the impetus of their rush, and both hands clasping their bayonets, end quote. In the middle of such a catastrophe, even something as seemingly small as a 24-hour truce can seem like the purpose of a lifetime, especially if it allows you to cross the lines and meet an enemy that you have always known as a friend and to treat him as such. The highly elusive scene of the blindfold removal from the eyes of an almost blind British officer, a hostage in the tent of an Ottoman officer who does not hesitate to speak words of friendship to him against the backdrop of the Battle of the Dardanelles, resembles the narrative climax of a fantasy tale. One may doubt that it truly happened. Unsurprisingly, an account of the truce was offered by Louis de Bernière in his novel Birds Without Wings, as told by one of his characters, the Ottoman soldier Karatavuk. It's a little bit long. I quote, it was when we were burying the dead that everything changed between us and the Australian and New Zealander Franks. The British Franks sent a special officer who spoke Turkish and Arabic, and his name was Honorable Herbert. This officer was the only one who could coordinate what all of us were doing. And so we Turks took orders from him, and so did the Australian and New Zealander Franks. Honorable Herbert gave us receipts for money and other things that were found on the dead. In the early evening, we had to finish our work, and the British Frank, Honorable Herbert, said, tomorrow you can shoot me. And we all said, may God prevent it. He came to our trenches, and some other Franks came, and they shook hands with us. And the Franks looked down on us and said, bye-bye, Abdul. And when they went, we all gave them a salam. Herbert also served in the war the following year, spending it in Iraq after a short convalescence with his family in England. Towards the end of the war, from July 1917, the British government seemed willing to agree upon a separate peace between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies. With this prospect in mind, Aubrey Herbert was summoned to meet prominent Ottoman personalities in Bern. in spite of his intentions being discovered by Armenian and Zionist activists who protested vehemently against the selection of a pro-Turk agent, Herbert spent some time in Switzerland, hanging out with the anti-Enver faction and putting forward some proposals for pacification. His following mission was in Albania, in the context of the British Adriatic Mission, side by side with the Italian army. Herbert's involvement in Italian politics makes sense, especially since Italy was moving more and more towards supporting the Kemalists and more generally Muslims, especially through Albanians. I haven't been able to trace the details of his cooperation with the Italian government, but Carlo Sforza, Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, from 1920 to 21, the main advocate of a Balkan pacification and the craftsman of the Treaty of Rapallo, founded his policy on principles that corresponded to Herbert's. As reported by Herbert in 1921, Talat himself thought, I quote, that Italian policy had been remarkably clever and that Italy had surmounted the worst of her difficulties. Her sympathy to Turkey would repay her. If only that were true. Herbert saw Talat in the second half of February 1921, a few days before a conference that took place in London between the Kemalists and the Allies. A Kemalist delegation led by Bekir Sami Bey Kunduh had left Ankara and embarked from Rhodes to Venice and Rome. Pictures were taken in front of St. Mark's Basilica among fluttering pigeons, and the Ministry of and in Rome, as this one, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the company of prominent Italian functionaries. From there, under Italian protection, the Kemalists reached London, where Bekir Sami presented a peace agreement that would reconnect Turkey to the Allies and prevent war against Greece. I quote, his proposals, wrote Herbert, which did not materially differ from those of Talat Pasha, like many other things of that time, were discreetly broadcasted and became known to the Bolshevists, who demanded Sami Bey's head upon a charger and duly received it. Negotiations broke down and war raged again in Asia Minor, for the sake of the Greeks and Turks, and indeed our own reputation. It is a pity that Talat Pasha was not able to have his way and to achieve peace. End quote. Aubrey Herbert, Carlos Sforza, Talat, and Bekir Sami were defeated, as were all those who cooperated at different levels for the sake of Turkey's rapprochement with the West. The Bolsheviks and the Kemalists signed their first agreement in March 1921 in Moscow, further ratified the year afterwards in Kars, and in 1922, as we know, in Erevan. The new Republic of Turkey remained in Soviet orbit until 1943. Apart from a propensity to economic planning and the foundation of a combinat-type factory in Kayseri, the political principles of the Republican leading class remained impervious to Soviet ideology. In as early as 1921, befriending a radically anti-communist leading class, the Bolsheviks gave priority to realpolitik than to any sort of ideological solidarity. Nevertheless, the two neighboring countries shared, of course, a common anti-imperialist standing. 3 years later, the Soviet ambassador to Rome invited Mussolini to the 7th celebration of the Russian Revolution, 1924. Just 4 months earlier, the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti had been murdered by a fascist squad before his speech in parliament. Deputies from the Labour Party had entrusted him with documents proving that Mussolini's brother was bribed with Mosul oil shares in exchange of support for British Eastern policy against Turkish claims in Iraq, Mosul. Talat was murdered in 1921. Aubrey Herbert died of septicemia in 1923 and Carlo Sforza, ousted by the fascists, would soon flee Italy for a 20-year-long exile. A serious perspective of the full integration of Turkey with Western countries has never been renewed since. Herbert's unconventional clairvoyance was seen as an oddity rather than an alternative. In 1919, his stepbrother, Porci Carnarvon, wrote to him, "You must not only see through Turkish glasses. Remember that you are an Englishman first, and as far as I know, with no drop of Turkish blood," an odd turn of phrase to use when writing to a visually impaired stepbrother. And I conclude, 100 years later, after another world war and innumerable regional conflicts, some of which are still ongoing, as we all know, the situation of the Near East appears catastrophic and hopeless. The fault lines haven't changed, and the Balkans always seem on the edge of a precipice. Europe falls prey to Russian-sponsored populist groups, which once again raise the flag of Islamophobia high, with the constant risk of developing into Turkophobia. How long will it take? How many human lives will be lost before world leaders take an ethically sustainable position towards the Near East and realize that in the long run, using Aubrey Herbert's words, partnership pays more than rapacity? Thank you very much.
One that really reinforces my opening words. What a great pleasure it is to revisit Aubrey Herbert. I think, particularly on a dark winter's night, what could be better?
Stop the screen sharing.
And chat. Well, who would like to ask our speaker? Jose, please go ahead.
Okay, so stop sharing. It's a little bit difficult to get.
Just exit, I would say.
Yeah.
Just click the X button. Yeah.
Stop
Okay, stop sharing. Yeah. Fine.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have the first question here.
Thank you. Vera, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I imagine that Herbert knew T. Lawrence. And did he ever express an opinion of T. Lawrence and his Arab support?
Yeah, he wasn't very fond of. Yeah.
I can imagine that.
Oh,
They're actually quite similar characters, aren't they?
Kind of,
Romantic in notions of, anti-imperialism and support for particular cause against,
Yeah.
they're just supporting opposite sides, but they're quite similar. I mean, he might not have liked his cause, but as an individual, did he ever express an opinion about it?
So they met in Cairo at the Arab Bureau. At first sight, they didn't like each other. I mean, I think Aubrey Herbert liked people like Issa Bulletin more. I mean, it's more his type of people. I mean, and so they dislike each other, and but then the relationship got slightly better with time. Yeah.
You also comment on this?
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Edith Durham didn't like Prince William of V, presumably Aubrey Herbert didn't. Did he have another candidate to be King of Albania?
Yes, he did. He did.
Who?
He was proposed twice.
No, but did he, after his own candidate?
No, he supported David. He supported David.
Hmm?
He supported.
He supported,
Yeah.
so he didn't dislike him as much as Durham did.
No.
Did he meet him?
I don't think so. I don't know. I'm not sure, but he supported with all his power. He did support. He was loyal to this proposal.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It seems like towards the end that he came around with and he sort of was willing to sort of reconsider the idea, but then.
Yeah, but he never really, I mean, no, it didn't work. He thought he was not rich enough to be king of Albania. That's what he wrote to many people.
Rather a witty response. Okay. But a comment and a question really. The comment is, this kind of Englishman that you're describing is not in fact that unusual. And so I think that if we were to set that in the wider context of particularly, well, of British society, I think we can say it's quite possible to find these figures, and therefore I think it's important not to draw a black and white picture of this imperialistic nation with one single person resisting it. In fact, there was a huge range of opinion and a huge range of activity. And you see, in effect, what the empire did was give very intelligent, adventurous young men, and a few women as well, a playground. And it wasn't only the empire, it was more because they had, because the British sterling was worth more than most other countries in the world. And so when they got fed up in this country, well, they could go out. And they could be a playboy or a playgirl, if you sort of mean it, almost a dilettante, or an amateur in the best sense of the word, sometimes in another country. And this is really a very, very characteristic aspect of British society. And so I equally, or maybe it's not me myself, but one could equally have given this paper saying Aubrey Herbert a typical response to the empire's playground. And show how this works. The number of travel books and similar kind of things written is in the thousands. And that reflects. So one could obviously mention Lawrence, has already been mentioned, but also there are people such as a man I've studied quite a lot called Frederick Hasbrook, who worked in Greece. About the same time, Hasbrook died in 1920. He equally was a highly independent individualist who was very, very opposed to the so-called glories of the Great War, which he despised, who also travelled a lot in Albania. He felt the consumption of killed, he thought he picked up in Albania because the travel conditions were so difficult. But equally, he in his own kind was an absolutely brilliant man. See, the other thing one has to appreciate is the quality of British education for those who were intelligent enough to absorb it and use it was fantastically high at the time. And so you get these highly developed intellects. And now that our system has been a mass education one, it's very difficult to piece out these. But in those days, somebody who was brilliant really could rise very, very quickly through the school system into somewhere like Eton perhaps, and then to Oxford or Cambridge, and then would really be already, as it were, a fully flourished historian or whatever it was. That's one route. But the other one, of course, is the well-known one of women also, who for whatever reason don't fit into the patriarchal structures of British society at the time. Then they were able, again, not so much because of the empire, but because if they had enough money, sometimes maybe as little as £100 a year or £200 a year, living overseas was cheaper. And so these really formidable women, though, have the possibility to get on a steamer and go and build a house again, as Margaret Hasbrook did for almost nothing in Albania, as Gertrude Bell did, and there are many other, there are so many Balkan women travellers that there are books written, as you know, just called Balkan Women Travellers, doing very, very similar things. All of them, again, with often, particularly the Baron, as you pointed out, with highly critical views of what they feel are the plodding stupidities of the Foreign Office and so on. And this is partly not only, as I think you referred to yourself in your talk, this is not only because they are ideologically differentiated from the ruling classes, that's possible, but in those days ideologies weren't phrased in the same way as today, unless you just use the simple one of the Bolsheviks, but rather the picture on the ground looks different if you know it. If you know the languages in your travel, then when you read a report from the Foreign Office, you know that the best will in the world, and saving your presence, Stephen, please. But when you read a report from the Foreign Office, you know that they're not right because you know the fine-grained detail that the diplomats living in even if they're well connected, living in their own cities, they can't really phrase it in the same way as you can. And so you get these sociological and intellectual possibilities of very, very intelligent, lively, brave people to come out and do all these things. That's my comment. And it's sparked by yes, it's sparked by, before I ask my question, I don't know if you want any thoughts to say about
No, I'm following what you're saying and I'm listening to you and thank you for these comments.
I was thinking, just because I've just finished Finkel's the adventure, yes, Sherlock Holmes. And I was just thinking, because Queen Victoria's, this is just the time that her reign ends, right? And she's the queen that basically learned Urdu, and as you know, as a monarch, open to other cultures and other languages, despite the fact that the imperial nature of her throne. But as opposed to that, I was also just recently rereading Ertuğrul Osman's memoirs. In there, he originally called, it's published, not that book in Turkey, and it's published as this Memories of a Şehzade, something like that. But he called the book 1 + 1 = 1 originally, and it's a great title. I think in my judgment, it's a brilliant title. And but he points out, as a, of course, compliment to his old empire, which I don't particularly share that view, but he says that in Ottoman Empire there were no classes, and there was only the Sultan. Well, I mean, in a way, it is true, because they took, for example, it could be the Sadrazam from completely slave, right? And they took they took them and they basically educated them in this Sarabia. And so in a way that there were certain toprakas, what we call is the land owners, etc. But not in the sense that Herbert was part of an aristocratic class here. So in that sense, there was always sort of like looking at both empires and analyzing them from each other's view, because there was a little bit distorted and of course, romantic.
Yeah, the point is, of course, that Turkish Ottoman society is based on individual talent, if you're lucky, and patronage. And the British one is based on political structures which are not the same as the structure of those who have access to the best education. And so, just as we saw in this very illuminating talk, some of them could go off and they could become part of the Conservative Party, but other ones could be a bit different, could join the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And there was space for the way this could be articulated in a way that again was not common in the Ottoman Empire. And the other great difference between the two spirits, as far as I can see, the spirits of empire, is that the British one was vastly interested in other cultures, at the same time, of course, as having this idea of the colonial British culture that they were spreading. The two were operating simultaneously. So at the same time, you have these dual ideas where we're deliberately experiencing huge varieties of cooking and of clothes and of writings and of literature. At the same time, though, as operating as the British Empire. And so you get this very, very interesting duality of cultural appreciation, with one side wishing to perpetuate a British culture, and the other ones being much, much more fluid in their understanding and much more multicultural. And this even reflects itself in country houses, in the gardens of country houses, and what they collect, which is so eclectic. However, in Turkey, Turkish culture, although there are a few travellers, of course we can all name the most famous one, they don't have the spirit of actually deliberately enjoying the multiculturality of the world. I mean, this is very, very strong even in Turkish culture until quite recently. You know, there isn't a deliberate and enjoyable, as it were, exploration of the multicultures of the world. People can be, of course, multilinguistic, but they rarely have the same sense of basic curiosity. There's There's some absolute cultural difference here between the two. So I think what I'm saying is you're absolutely right. All these empires are not the same in the dynamics.
But I'll interject, but when a British leaves England at those times, at home, he's exposed to how many, even if he's a nobleman, you know, he goes to Eton, he goes to Oxford, he's just surrounded, you know, however eccentric, he's just surrounded, maybe few Catholics if he's lucky, few Jews, that's it. Whereas a Turk, even from the most remote village, would have an Armenian, would have a Rum, would have Cherkess, would like, you know, like they grew up with this, like he's already in a multicultural, multilingual world. So he's like, if he is interested, he's already exposed to it, like he wouldn't be,
Taking ideas and.
yeah.
But that's the point, you see. The point you make is absolutely relevant to unity, but I think that is absolutely the point. The point is that the whole of the Ottoman Empire is built on assuming that the cultural, not the ethnic, but the cultural purity of the Sunni millet, because unless you can maintain that, you can't run the country.
Yes, he's still not pure.
I
You
know,
know, like,
oh,
they're
yeah,
like-
I'm saying there's an ethnic difference.
I know, but in the sense, like in the traditions, you know, you have the Bektashi, they're like, I would say,
Orthodox.
yeah, like none of the
But the
practices.
dominant ethos of the Ottoman Empire is to maintain, however much there are other currents, a Sunni form of Islam and the military power of the Ottoman Empire.
But wasn't that true of the British Empire too, to maintain the Anglican Church and to spread it indeed, which the Ottomans were not doing.
No, but it didn't operate in the same way because you didn't have the cultural plurality, just as you said. We didn't have that cultural plurality in Britain, and so it didn't need to have set up the internal defences to make sure that cultural distinction was maintained. You see what I mean? If you're working with 5 or 6 millets in Turkey, the dominant
dialect.
right?
It's not easy for the British to forget about Ireland.
If you're sitting in Turkey, your job as a servant of the Ottomans, as a slave of the Ottoman Empire, is to maintain the Ottoman Empire. You do that through the dominance of religion and dominance of the military, even if you draw other people into it. And all the time, as you're going across Istanbul and meeting these multiple different cultures, you know that yours is distinct and you don't mix them.
I think we have to, I mean, if we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire in this way, we have to distinguish which period of the Ottoman Empire we're talking about, because it changed tremendously over the whole life of the empire. And indeed, there were actually 2 Ottoman empires, because in 1402, the first one disappeared. But yeah, if you look at the Arab world, I mean, you had Arab elites and Arab elites from all religions, which were not really comparable to the Ottoman elites.
Well, quite, but
and weren't really integrated.
well, quite, but that's
into
the point that I'm making. Yes, and nor did the Turks in Istanbul wish for them to become it.
Yes, but the point is that the Ottomans weren't really trying to spread themselves in the way that the British or the French or you know, any other, or the Spanish or the Portuguese. Their object of empire was actually to civilize the places that they were going to, and their idea of civilization was to spread their own culture and their own religious values to the others, which the Ottomans were not trying to do.
Well, they didn't have much choice. They were trying to hang
Well,
on.
they
to
had,
it.
no, but again, you're talking about the later period, we're not. So, you know,
It was Turcophile, that's why you were interested in this.
Yes, the discussion was very
no,
interesting,
no,
really. I mean, I think it
no.
was the core of the question, in fact. So I'm very proud that my talk was able to be a stimulus for such an interesting discussion. Because I think that one of the main topics why I liked Aubrey Herbert, because after reading so many documents from the National Archives, from the Foreign Office, I mean, the historian really kind of you know, it's really hard because there's no hope, there's no way out. It seems that the whole British government has decided that Turkey has ceased to exist. There's no way out. They hate the Muslims. They hate. I mean, the worst part of the British society becomes the part that takes decisions for all, even for people that are outside the British Empire. So when I read about Aubrey Herbert and I was working on Carlo Sforza, that was the topic of my research in the 2 last summers in the National Archives. I was following this Italian High Commissioner, and so there were these documents that I was quoting in my talk of the last encounter between Talat Pasha and Aubrey Herbert. And that's something that nobody knows, completely unknown, because we know that Talat Pasha has been execrated. I mean, he died really completely. He was killed. First of all, he didn't die. He was killed, assassinated, and he was accused of all the worst crimes of humanity. So to find out that the last person Talat Pasha had met a few days before being killed was a British Turcophile, I thought, well, it's certainly worth of attention. Then I read the documents of Aubrey Herbert are kept in Somerset, not in Kew. So I wrote to the Somerset archives and I asked to send some of the material, especially the interview to Talat Pasha. And while reading it, I found out that the main concepts were the same concepts that Carlo Sforza wanted to emerge during the London Conference in 1921. They were defeated by the Russians and by the Bolsheviks, and also by part of the British government that had made an agreement with the Bolsheviks against a Turkish rapprochement to the West. So I think that's very, very important to say, to find out and to let emerge. Because somehow the West always prefers Russia, whatever Russia looks like, rather than the Muslim world.
Not in the Crimea, but yes.
Can I just say something about Aubrey Herbert, the politician, and Aubrey Herbert, the diplomat? I mean, to me, it's very contradictory that he could have had these 2 careers, almost one after the other. And one wonders where he really was wanting to go. Of course, he died young, so we never knew. But can you say a bit more about that and how that affected, the politics of the area in a way? I mean, the way that he had these 2 careers, and then he was no longer with us. But maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So
apparent contradiction.
My impression that he was a contradiction to the British government, so they didn't know where to put him. If you look on the internet, on Wikipedia, for example, it's written soldier. It's not written diplomat. It's not written politician. It's written soldier. So they dismissed him. And he didn't fit into any of the 2 categories. I mean, he went to interview Talat as a secret agent of Scotland Yard, not, on account of the Foreign Office. Even during World War I, I think there was this contradiction, and nobody from the Foreign Office and the Arab Bureau wanted to hire him, and precisely because he was a pro-Turkish person. So there was no space for this idea, I think.
He was also a very, very good writer.
Excellent writer.
He was going with
Excellent.
wonderful articles. Ben Kendim is wonderful.
Yeah, excellent writer, really.
I sometimes wonder what the aristocracy thought of him, the English aristocracy. Was he a good aristocrat, for example?
So,
Or did he
The
actually,
phrase "gone native."
yeah,
whether he developed a lot of enemies within the aristocracy?
I think he was appreciated. I haven't found a lot of accounts because he was a man of action. So he was more interested in doing something. And I don't think this attitude was always shared by his peers. He developed excellent friendships in Oxford, but not in Eton. In Eton, he had a terrible time, really terrible. I mean, he was even thrown out. I mean, there were a lot of problems. He was feeding all the time street dogs and animals of any kind, and that was
All the time, right?
yeah. Even in Istanbul, he was feeding dogs, and he loved animals. For example, he was a very peculiar person, a very very special person, I would say. Yeah.
Another anti-imperialist aristocrat slightly earlier was Wilfrid Blunt, whose diaries are extraordinary.
Ah.
He talks about, he was pro-Egyptian,
Hmm.
and he talks about the empires of 1900 as great white thieves.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting to compare.
I mean, that's why they had that slogan, the Turks must go. They had to make up something,
Yeah.
because when you defend your country, you can say, oh, we're defending the country, but when you're invading into other people's territory, you have to put them down, make something else.
May I just ask a question? When it's needed 2 points. Very interesting, by the way, thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned that he's a Philo-Turk, but also he developed this affinity with Constantini.
Yes.
A couple of things. First of all, is it true that the anecdote that Constantini came to London with 2 guns, he handed out one, and then when he was told that actually he was disarmed by the British and Turks never did it, he practically pulled the other one, so he hadn't given 2 guns. So it's an anecdote that all Albanians discuss. I don't think it's true anyway. So my point is, was he supporting Albania as a Philo-Turk in order to protect Muslims or multiculturalism, or he had the affinity for Albanians because they really deserved to really have the independence? Because as far as I know, Philo-Turks, in fact, were not interested in Albanians' independence at all.
You're right.
Do you have any information? Because there's a mixture there. Philo-Turks didn't want Albania to be independent, and in fact, they didn't want to give independence at all. So the Austria, Italy actually got together, in fact, to have that enclave there. So my curiosity is that did he develop that affinity with Constantini directly because he believed in Albanian cause, or as a Philo-Turk?
It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. So actually, his first soulmate, Albanian soulmate, was not Issa Boletin, but was Kazim, a person that he had met in Macedonia, and who introduced him to the Balkans, let's say. And that was even before the Turkish Revolution, the Young Turk Revolution. So his first approach to the Ottoman Empire was through the Balkans. Plus, the Young Turks he met, he hanged out with, were from the Balkans themselves, from Thessaloniki, from Salonika, like Talat, for example, from Edirne, so they were all Balkan people. So I think he had a sort of anthropological passion for these people. He was passionate about them. He liked their way. And he felt that their way looked very much like his way. That's also something that it's not obvious, because one may romanticize a little bit the East and how the Orient looks like and so on. No, Aubrey Herbert was not like that. He looked for people, for soulmates, for real friends, and that's very much an Oriental, an Eastern feature.
Yeah.
So he really found a mirror. And I think that in Albania, he cooperated with the Italians before fascism, so with liberal Italy, with Carlo Sforza's ideas, precisely because in Italy, with Carlo Sforza, before the fascists, there was still a sort of Renaissance attitude towards the East. That was completely destroyed by the fascists. Completely. Nothing has been left of that. But Carlo Sforza was a sort of, neo-Venetian. Let me call him like that, So, for example, he ordered a lion of San Marco for the embassy in Istanbul when they reconquered the embassy, Venediktara in Istanbul. So, it's very interesting. It's a sort of aristocratic culture that there was in common between the Balkans, Italy, and England. The three countries had in common this feature that unfortunately, I don't think that much has been left of that. Coming to your question, there was, I think, no contradiction because times had changed. So in 1908, it was crucial to support the Young Turk Revolution because that was a moment when things could change. The Young Turks, they wanted the constitution, they had the constitution. Abdulhamid II was in big trouble. Then he had to resign, to abdicate. And so that was the moment, the crucial moment when England could have supported the Ottoman Empire. They didn't. So this perspective was completely defeated. And Aubrey Herbert, when the Balkan Wars started, so the circumstances had changed, started to deal with Albanian independence. Because in any case, the Ottoman Empire, once Great Britain chose not to support the Young Turks, was over. That's the point. I mean, World War I was decided in 1908, in fact.
Yeah, and by Austria taking Bosnia, as if it
Yeah.
didn't have enough problems already.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was no point in being stubborn and defending the Young Turks when it was clear that they would have gone into Germany's arms. And Aubrey Herbert was certainly not pro-German, that's for sure. That's absolutely for sure.
But that was my question, actually. Did you come across any more material about the Ottoman entry on the German side? I mean, did this dialogue between Talat Pasha and Herbert carry on, or did you see any references to it?
Yes, they say a few things more, but doesn't bring them so much more significant material to what I have already said. I'm at least as far as I could see. Talat disliked the Germans completely. I mean, Talat says more about the Germans in the interview. He says, he even said, I understood why the English hated the Germans.
Wow.
So, that's big stuff.
And did you give any reason for disliking the Germans?
Yeah, there was a military issue, now I don't remember. I can find it out, though I have it in my computer. There was something that the Germans mistreated the Turks. They said something or they did something that made them, I don't know if they agreed upon. That was before the war, actually, if I remember well. I have to look up again, but that was perhaps in the immediate eve of the war. That the Germans didn't say anything to the Ottomans and put the Ottomans in front of the necessity to do something that now I don't remember. But yeah, it was a sort of attitude that Talat hated. I mean, Talat didn't have a good relation with Enver either. So
Yes, and Enver was the pro-German, of course.
yeah.
But they came with a big project when they came in, I mean, the Germans, it's much bigger than the Ottomans expected, I guess, but they came and then they start ordering, basically, after violence.
Well, I think we just have to ask our colleagues on screen. Whether
Yes.
anybody on screen has a question. If you do, please raise your hand. It's a very
Okay.
interesting. Many thanks.
You're welcome.
Any questions from
I
our?
want to know.
Oh, there's one question, yeah, last question.
I think the job unmuted.
Oh.
Ask for after.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll take Stephen's now.
Yeah, after you.
Yeah, I just wondered whether you know the house which the family lives in.
Bixton,
And I just wondered whether that is a place where you can go and look around, like in Darwin's house, and whether there are sort of clues as to, learning more about the family, basically.
I haven't been, but I'm looking forward and I'm planning to go to Somerset Archives.
I'm waiting for the invitation.
I'm planning to go this summer.
Yeah.
And was there a question on screen? If there is, then please do ask it now.
Altogether.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no further questions, we have to thank our speaker for a thoroughly
You're
stimulating.
welcome. Thank you.